Hey everyone, welcome back to Behind the Curtain Podcast. I'm Ryan, Josh is here, and we have a guest, Dr. Ronn Johnson, who just launched the Divine Council Worldview Podcast. Very excited about the conversation tonight because Josh and I have discussed words like Elohim and Malak and the gods of the nations. We talked about Michael Heiser a lot, and you are right there kind of in the middle of this material. And so we're very grateful to have you on and give us a kind of a deeper understanding of this stuff since that's what your background is in. So please go ahead and take a moment and introduce yourself to the audience. Let them know who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. Ronn Johnson's my name. Grew up in Minnesota, Wisconsin actually, but schooled in Minnesota. Went off to Bible college and wanted to teach the Bible. That was my goal. So met my wife at school there. She's from Pennsylvania. And then we went off to seminary, 2 or 3. I guess it was 3 different seminaries by the time I was done through Dallas Seminary. So taught then in my alma mater, a little Pillsbury Baptist Bible College in Owatonna, Minnesota. That's where Mike went to school with me as fellow students originally. Then we both were teaching there too, back in the early 90s. And then from there, I also took a pastorate at the same time. So I was pastoring and teaching Bible college for about 15 years, doing both, and full-time pastor, part-time teacher. And then, but by the time I finished my ministry, as it were, back in 2013. And by the way, this subject that we're talking about tonight was really the principal reason that I lost my pastorate and my teaching credentials, or not credentials, but what do you call it? Just, my job was because of this kind of material. So,
oh wow!
If that keeps your audience wanting to hear more, that's fine.
Wow!
Some of this stuff is the very reason that my denomination came to me and said, we really can't have you talking about this if it's going to influence the way you read the Bible to that degree. And we left amiably. I was part of an E-Free church, and we're friends to this day. But they just admitted, and I did too. After what was a 5-hour grilling in a session, that they just admitted, or we both admitted, that we were just talking 2 different kinds of Bible, shall we call it? And so,
wow,
took our different ways. And I gave my resume to the wind, and the Lord's taking care of us. I'm a technical writer for a bank now, and so 8 hours a day I do that, and then the happiest part of my day is turning off that and reading emails from people around the world who want to talk about the Divine Council. So.
Yeah,
that's what I do.
That's so cool.
That's one of the coolest things, that just from listening, and we'll have plenty of time to get into this in a little bit, but I think I started the 3rd episode of your Divine Council Worldview podcast today, and y'all were talking about how people around the world, like America has kind of lost this. It's almost too sensational for people to talk about gods and stuff, but the rest of the world and other cultures, they're dealing with this stuff all the time, and it's easy for them to accept. And so,
Right.
It's very, very interesting to me, and really changed the way that I read the Bible a couple of years ago when I found Unseen Realm. And so that's why we started this podcast. But yeah, I mean, what kind of got you into that? Because the Divine Council it's not something that a lot of people talk about openly in church. And you said that you left, pastoring over it. And so it was that important to you. What kind of started that journey for you?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to my relationship with Mike. Okay. And so in 81, which is just after the Civil War for some of you people, I met Mike.
I was born the next year at 82.
I told you. So we're standing in the stairwell of our dorm at 10 o'clock, and I met this guy named Mike. I didn't know him. He's from Pennsylvania. I'm from Minnesota, and we struck up. I was a sophomore. He was a freshman, and we struck up a conversation about election and free will. It just happened to be what we're talking about. And I was at the top of the stairwell, and he was at the bottom. And we knew we were having fun, and also the time was going. And all of a sudden, it was 5 a.m. in the morning, and we had started at 10 at night. So 7 hours into this wonderful friendship that developed from that moment. we became fast friends. And so same Bible or the same baseball team, and we'd be in the van talking about the Bible, the whole time, and we'd play baseball. But point is that we became fast friends. We went off to seminary together. Our wives were friends. Our kids were born about the same time. When I came back and was the chairman of that little Bible college in Owatonna, the Bible department, they asked me to bring in another Bible teacher because we needed one. And I called Mike and said, let's do it. And Mike jumped at it. And so we were on the same faculty then for a couple of years. He continued on to go to Madison to get his PhD. I, at that point, was finishing up my PhD at Dallas Seminary. So that's the aha moment for me. If I can tell that story, because maybe that's where we can, kind of nail in as to what the Divine Council Worldview even is. And I think it's easiest to describe it in terms of that aha moment, that Mike had. And if you read Unseen Realm, he begins with that, where he's sitting in church in Madison, and a friend has him turn to Psalm 82 in Hebrew and read it. Right. For me, it was a St. Paul Cafe. He had just started writing his dissertation on the Old Testament gods, and I didn't know his topic. And so he came up to St. Paul. This was after I was out of town and came back, and hey, Mike, how you doing? Where are you in your dissertation? And I was in my dissertation phase too. I hated my topic, and I was bored with it. And so we met at a cafe, and he took out a napkin and drew, as it were, like a diagram. I still have that napkin, by the way. The picture, or a very simple concept of a divine being in Yahweh and humans, and how they would relate. And he's telling me this as though the gods are real, right? And I had always been brought up at standard evangelical church background, Baptist with my background, that the gods of the Old Testament were made up. They're fake, or they're like money and sex and boats and cars today.
Right.
So for the Bible people, they made up these beings in their head, and that's all they were. And so he was talking as though these beings were actual spirits that God had made and that were in charge of the nations, okay? And I remember stopping him and saying, wait a second, are you saying that if I asked Moses if the gods of the Old Testament were real, that he would say yes? And then in classic Mike response, he said, no, I'm saying that that Moses would be surprised at the question. In other words, he presumed that they were real.
Right.
And I tell you, that was my aha moment where, and I'm sure you guys have had this kind of thing too, where you get a truth in your head and you start to test drive it, and you can almost physically see dominoes tipping,
Yep.
down the way. Well, that's going to affect this and this and this. And so my mind went spinning. And the emails started going between me and him. I got my dissertation topic changed to the gods of the Old Testament and the relationship to Paul's principalities and powers. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised, stunned at the same time, maybe, that nobody had ever written on that. No one had ever, as an evangelical, tied Paul's 6 times he mentions principalities and powers. No one had ever directly tied those back to the Old Testament spirits. They had usually gone to some pantheon idea, or second century,
right,
first century Judaism's view of the Greek and Roman pantheon. And I didn't, I followed Mike's tack in saying, let's try this out. So that was my foray into the study that changed my view of how to read the Bible. And let's leave it there for now. I mean, as we keep talking, that's my introduction to it. And then my professional offer to the world. I finished a dissertation on it. So
yeah, which I'm reading right now. You were gracious enough to send us a copy, and I'm loving it. How long were you at DTS?
3 years, 88 to 91.
I took a few classes there. I was a student at Christ for the Nations right there in Dallas.
Oh yeah. Good school.
And I graduated there, and then I went to DTS for a couple semesters, and then ended up moving. But yeah,
where'd you live in Dallas?
I was in Oak Cliff.
Yeah, down there in the south. Okay, yeah.
Right in a great part of town. Yeah, a lot of fun. But I had
Lee Harvey Oswald territory.
I had great memories there at Christ for the Nations. But yeah.
Josh, when was your Reformed phase? Was that at that time?
I got Reformed. ironically, at Christ for the Nations, there was one professor that was kind of Reformed Calvinist, and I swayed that way for a very long time.
Well, and Dallas would have been that way too.
Right. So. And then, when I started listening to Dr. Heiser, which I found through researching aliens and UFOs, I had a uncle of mine that was asking me about UFO stuff, and I was like, I don't know, I'm gonna go check that out, and stumbled upon Dr. Heiser's stuff.
A lot of people
UFO
find
conferences.
A lot of people find Mike through that UFO alien stuff, and I'm glad, because he was interested in making that a Christian issue when it comes to those beings. I remember driving somewhere. We were in town. I remember where I was, at what stoplight I was at, in fact, and I said, well, what do you think a lot of this stuff is? He said one of two things to me. It's either government or it's an Elohim. And in other words, you can take that extraterrestrial idea and not make it weird by just saying, instead of saying they're extraterrestrial, let's make them celestial. Paul believed, 1 Corinthians 15, in a terrestrial life and also a celestial life. And so that was his normal way of thinking. And boy, you can really make good sense of a lot of that world, which I don't do much, but at least that was a good answer in my mind. So,
yeah, I loved how he took the approach, and I had never heard anybody talk about that kind of stuff and be a Christian. And so, like you said, it's I think all things are Christian matters, really, when you think about it, and we need an answer for all of that stuff. But,
well, you mentioned Paul having that kind of celestial, that there's an active spiritual world, and one of the things we've discussed on the podcast before is Paul's when he goes to what the Areopagus, right, and he's talking to people and he's saying, he finds a statue to the unknown God, and he's addressing how that God has saved them and all that. These are the principalities and powers that Paul is referring to in his epistles. He's talking about other gods, not just people, right?
Yeah, and so that's my dissertation, basically saying that when you follow through on what an Old Testament Elohim is, and then follow into Paul's theology, the matches are eerily, I would say, easy to see. The same, created status, divine beings, the role they play in being given authority over the nations. That's the principality word in Greek. It has a territorial authority concept built into it in Greek. And so when you just make those easy, I think, easy connections, but you notice you have to start by saying the gods are real. In other words, N.T. Wright, as much as I love him, he starts in a backwards way. He'll start with, let's say, Acts 17, and think that Paul's opponents there in Athens were believing in the Roman or Greek pantheon, Thor, Zeus, whatever. And since those are made up, then he retrofits that idea of a pantheon, a made-up pantheon, back into Baal, Melkart, Chemosh, and the Old Testament deities. And I'm arguing, well, Mike is, and again, the Divine Council Worldview is a very simple idea, really, at base, and that is go left to right in the Bible, not right to left. Just start at the beginning and say, Psalm 8, we are created below Elohim, plural beings. Now, if I'm real, why aren't they real? In other words, am I created below Mickey Mouse, or am I created below some real spiritual entity called, and this is key, Elohim? Now, if a person says, aren't those angels? Here comes, again, the biggest, not biggest. See, and I have a hard time explaining this to a college classroom. So can I give it a 3-minute version to you guys and see if it's going to make sense?
Yeah.
Go for it.
The word malach in Hebrew or angelos in Greek has a simple translation, very straightforward, non-religious meaning. It just means messenger.
Right.
So if you look it up in a dictionary, again, malach or angelos simply and only means messenger. It's not a religious word. Well, our Bibles trick us because what they do, and then all the theology books go along with it, when they come upon the word malach and they think it's a divine being, they give you a different word than messenger. Now, they owe you the word messenger. They owe it to you because that's what the word means. Mm-hmm. They decide, and they do this with angelos in the New Testament too, they decide if it's a spirit being they invent a name, a word in English that had never been used before called angel. And if a person says, well, wait, angel and angelos, they sound the same. No, that's the trick. Angelos means messenger. It never meant angel. If you had said to Paul, what's an angel? He'd say, I don't know. That word, we don't have, it's like refrigerator. We don't have that word. And we'd say, well, you have angelos. And he'd say, I know, messenger. Timothy is a messenger to Ephesus for me.
Right.
And then if I said, is he an angel? He'd say, no, I said angelos. In other words, what our theology books do is they go looking for the word angel in the Bible, and they find it 210 times. And they develop a theology of angels out of that. The problem is they're looking at a word that doesn't mean angel every time. And I hope that's making sense. But most college 20-year-olds look at me like I'm... Well, they think I'm being conspiratorial. And they're saying, and by the way, this is where my Bible department chairman came to me and said, how many gods do you think there are, Ron? I mean, he said this right in front of some students. He said, how many gods are there? And he knew what he was asking because he had been hearing things. And I said, and I shouldn't have done this. I said, do you mean in Greek or English? And he said, you know what I mean. And I said, no, I don't know what you mean. And in other words, if you're not going to, I mean, he's a chairman too. I mean, so we both knew Greek. And the fact that he would ask me the English question that really needs to go into the Greek and Hebrew, background, I found to be a little disingenuous. But the point, and we're friends today, but I remember that was that one moment where we're talking two different languages right in front of the students. And the point is this, that it's a simple idea. Don't retrofit English ideas backwards. And Mike was big about this.
Right.
And if you want to follow the Bible left to right, you're going to experience a world, two things. You're going to experience a world that's unbelievably simple, because if it was above the horizon, it's an Elohim. If it's below the horizon, it's an Adam or an Ish. It's a human. Mm-hmm. Very simple cosmology. Now, how do you know the difference between the God of Israel and all the other gods? Well, listen to the Bible talk. It'll talk about the Most High God. It'll use, the God of Israel, that phrase, or the Lord God of hosts. In other words, the word Elohim, translated as God in the Bible, is a tricky word too, because it's just a standard stock word coming out of Phoenician, Akkadian, Ilu. It's not invented by God. He used a cultural term, or Moses did, and the writers of the Old Testament, to define that anything above the horizon is an Il, or in Hebrew, Elohim. And it's us that put the capital G on the word God. And I think we make a mistake too quickly. Again, and I don't think the Bible's being conspiratorial here, or our translators. But if they had uncapitalized or never capitalized the word God in our Bibles, what it would force the reader to do after he got offended, number one. But number two, he would be forced to ask every time he comes upon the word God, which one? And I'd recommend that's how the Bible sounds to the average, or to the first-time reader. They were always hearing the word Elohim with this background thought of, well, which one are you talking about? And that's why they would say the God of Israel, because otherwise the word God is too plastic for definition. So I think we do a disservice to our Bible readers when Bible translations just go with capital G as a stock word and don't admit that sometimes it should be a small g. Can I give you a quick example? This is one of those moments where I'll never forget. Back when the TNIV, today's NIV, was being, the NIV was being updated, 2010 or so. And the general editor allowed people at the ETS meeting that year. It was advertised if you wanted to come to a certain hotel suite where the ETS was meeting and meet the general editor, you had 10 minutes and you could make a case for any translational wish that you had for the new NIV. So I put together, and I still have it, a list of 19 places in the Bible where I believe the NIV should lowercase the G to be more accurate with the reading.
So this was your 19 theses.
Yeah.
Nailing upon the door.
One of them, and this is an example, one of them would be Daniel 3, where Nebuchadnezzar, who never had a class in Israelite theology, right? He's looking into a furnace and he says, I see 4 people.
Right.
And one of them is like the son of the gods.
Yep.
Well, the NIV goes son of God, capital G, capital S. In other words, they think it's Jesus. And I understand that, okay, it makes it easier for the person in the pew to I don't know, understand their Bible. At least that's
to
how
make
they're
that
thinking
connection. Yeah.
And but I would recommend that's not what Nebuchadnezzar said. He said, I see a being in there that's not a human. And the only term I have in
Elohim.
Aramaic is Bar Elohim, a son of the gods, a divine class being. I don't know what it is. It's not human. So the only stock answer or word he had in his lexicon was son of God. And it's not capitalized to him. It would just be a divine class being. And I said to the chairman or the editor, here am I 19. I think we could make a case, or I could easily make a case that each one of these should be a small g, and not one of the 19 made it into the. So as soon as it came out, I looked. I was curious if any of them did, but none of them did. So I think our versions are even, again, don't think conspiracy, but I think our versions are so averse to causing an audience, a church, to be offended or to be shocked that they just don't get into the possibility that might not be Yahweh. It might be another deity, right? And I think there are numerous places where we're talking about a different deity.
That's so funny that you brought that up, because I remember asking a pastor a long time ago. I read that scripture where Nebuchadnezzar looks in and he says, I see, one like the Son of God. Right. And I remember asking him, I'm like, how does he know what the Son of God looks like?
That's exactly my thought.
Yeah, right.
Like, how does he know? And that was one of the questions that lingered in my mind for a while. I was like, maybe this isn't translated the best way.
Now, do you think by the way, here's the average answer back is, do we really want to go through the trouble of causing our church people to be frustrated or to be questioning their Bible, or, do you think, and this is an honest question, I'm asking two guys like this that I appreciate dearly, but I've never met you before, right? And we're just talking shop here. Do you think our churches would benefit from Son of the Gods or capital S, capital G? Which one would help the person in the pew?
Yeah. I'll answer first, Ryan. I am not pastoral in any kind of sense, so I don't see that being helpful as far as keeping the way it is. I think we should know what the actual scripture says, like literally says, because I think that's our job as Christians. That's why I don't like paraphrases. It's like, I want to know, what did it say? And I want to know what the people reading it at the time thought about it. Because I think if you don't, you kind of lose the meaning and the context. And I understand, I know pastors, a lot of modern pastors, they're, my dad was a pastor for like 15 years, so I get it.
And mine was too. I'm a pastor's kid. So.
Exactly. So I think they're overworked. It's a very stressful job. It's very time consuming. It's a lot. And, when, I don't know, I feel like they're faced with like, do I spend 40 hours in the Word or do I spend 40 hours taking care of the flock?
Exactly. So, I understand that. And I pastored myself and, that world.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's why I lean toward like a plurality of elders. I think there's a fivefold ministry for a reason, that pastoral gifting can be used to shepherd the flock. And then I think there's teachers and prophets that can stand in and divide the word. But,
yeah,
that's what I think.
Yeah. My answer is pretty similar. I mean, I would say, me personally, I can only speak for myself. I'm pretty nerdy guy. I like to be challenged. I like technical kind of thinking. Right. So for me, part of me is like, no, it should be difficult. People should have to be pushed a little bit. Right. I would love to know what the original language says, but kind of like Josh is saying, I think that, I would say, yes, I think it should be changed. But something you said earlier made me think of this, that, in our culture, we're kind of taught to just blindly believe the Bible and just not question it. Because, you might get off into error if you dig too deep in one, random thing. And the problem is that we're reading the Bible with an American, lens in the 21st century lens. So we don't have that historical context. So I would love for finding a translation of the Bible that more accurately reflects the actual word and language, like you're saying. But that would mean to me that people would have to be teaching that material, and I think kind of like Josh said that, it's difficult for pastors because that material just isn't really out there in a high quantity. Right. And that's why I loved Mike Heiser's material, because he was trying to get that to the lay people,
Right.
And every Bible is an interpretation. I mean, you have to, going from any language from one to the other, you're going to have to make interpretive choices.
Right.
Glosses. What one word can I put in place of dikaiosune? Is it righteousness or justice? I mean, they always have to choose, and that's where N.T. Wright and others battle. Entire doctrines are based on how should we define one word here and over there. I mean, that's the joy of seminary and trying to teach this stuff.
Well, and that's why I like that you brought up the malak and being a job description, a messenger. Right. And not like a ontologically or species, what that being is. I saw a clip of you on Instagram explaining that on, I think Michael Heiser's page shared it. And some of the comments were just totally shut it out, oh, that's not what that means. There's only one God. And it's like, you people just aren't paying attention to what.
I don't know. Comments, so. Okay. I was about to say, I was like, you might not even know. There's the video, there's a little clip, and you're talking about, we need to get this word angel out of our minds when we're reading.
Yeah. It was,
and man, people are like, what?
I think the majority, I will say the majority of people were with you because it was on Michael Heiser's page.
Right.
And so
don't y'all read Dr. Heiser's stuff?
It was odd there were two or three comments that stood out to me that just completely missed it. And it was like, y'all must have never looked up Dr. Michael Heiser before, because this is totally in line with what he's saying. But it made a lot of sense to me when I found that, because it made the whole, even the whole gospel and the Great Commission and everything make more sense.
Oh, like you say, the dominoes tip, and just all of a sudden you realize you're farther down than you that you thought you could ever be because of simple changes like that.
Right.
Cool.
Right.
And when I stumbled upon Heiser's stuff and others, I was aggravated. I got really angry, because I went to Bible college, and I was a pastor's kid, and I grew up in the church, and I was like, why was I never told this stuff? Why? And it almost gets to like that conspiratorial thing. Like, what are the seminaries hiding from us?
I've wondered that, and here's my theory. If you don't mind me giving you my, because I've wondered a lot about this. Because Mike and I both, as we talked about it, we kind of made this deal, this wink, wink, that we're not creating anything new here, right? This is not inventing new material. It's simply taking liberal material. Here's what I found in doing my dissertation. Liberals who don't really believe the Bible is historically accurate, they believe that the Old Testament taught that the gods were real. But the problem is, it's all myth anyway. So myth upon myth, right?
Right.
But if you asked Moses, he would have said, yeah, they're real. Yeah. And all we're doing, Mike and I, is we're evangelicals. We're saying the Bible's true and the gods are real. So we're just making that little bit of turn, but it's huge. And then we say, now read your Bible. Now read your Bible as though it's actually what Moses thought. And that's a challenge. I mean, people back then thought the earth was, up on poles and maybe even flat and all that stuff. But the point is that when it comes to are there divine beings, Moses would have said yes, and we believe that too. The problem is we call them anachronistically angels, and they call them gods.
Right.
So it starts there. But my theory on why this isn't taught more is because, and this is just my theory, I don't have any, I'm not a church historian, that close out of the first century, getting into the second, third centuries, that as the church fathers started to even create a theology, if you want to call it that, they started to hover over the concept, and for reasons I'm not sure, that the sin to forgiveness model, that the problem of mankind is unforgiven sin, and thus we need to be forgiven because we have a holy God, and that's why we need forgiveness. Otherwise, we can't be with Him in heaven, and you know that story. Mm-hmm. And then by the time you get to the established Roman Catholic medieval Church, the Reformers fought against how forgiveness works. So no Eucharist, no indulgences, that kind of stuff. But notice that they didn't challenge the original question. So they had good answers to many questions. The Reformers were good guys, but they didn't go back to the first century and rethink the whole problem. And so my argument is that if you miss the problem at the front end, you're going to miss the solution at the back end. And so the problem to me, as I read, and again, I'd go all the way back to Genesis, the problem isn't sin to forgiveness, or the problem isn't sin that needs to be forgiven. The problem is worship that is given to the wrong deity. Mm-hmm. Now, if that's the form of the question, okay, that Abraham worshiped the right deity, thus he's righteous, period. That's all he had to do in order to be righteous. He just had to believe, which is the Hebrew word aman, which amunah, same word, different vowels, means faithfulness. So Abraham became faithful to one deity, and he's called righteous because of it. If you take that model and drop it into every story from there on out, it works for me. And when you get to sin and forgiveness issues like in Leviticus, it'll be a sub-story, but it's a sub-story. It's not the main story. God didn't give Abraham the law, which tells me it's not as important as other things. That's a Moses thing. That's a nation of Israel thing for me. But when it comes to righteousness and the question of the gospel, thus, shall we say, is always going to go back to that first story and all the stories that come from that, and that is simply, are you worshiping the right Elohim? That question has never and again, I don't know how to say this without sounding too frustrated. I have never yet. Yeah, I mean, I've taught theology for 23 years in Bible college, I think, by the time I got done. I have not found one theology. Now, this sounds too strong to believe, but I challenge your listeners to do this. Pick up a theology book and ask, how does a person get saved? Just ask that question and then open up the book and look. I defy you to find one theology book that says this: it's the God you choose to worship. Right. Nobody comes up with that. And to me, it's like, how did we miss that simple? Well, you know how we missed it? We didn't believe the gods were real. Right. That's why. So that when where do I want to go with that? There's too many directions, I guess, in my head. But it to me, such a simple idea that we miss it and we start complicating it with Levitical laws and sacrifice and atonement and all those parts that we think have to be fulfilled on the New Testament side, and in some sense they are, and then we retrofit that back into the Old Testament. And by the time you're done, you've come up with this system of salvation that is, again, I think anachronistic. We think of what Jesus does and we retrofit that back into the Old Testament and call it foretelling or predictive of what Jesus will do. So now sacrifice predicts Jesus' death. Well, if you were talking to Moses about a sacrifice, he wouldn't have said this is predictive of anything. It's not predicting anything. It's doing what we do when we worship a deity. Right. So why call it predictive if the guy who's doing it never would have called it predictive? That's unfair to me as I read the Bible. And to me, a Divine Council Worldview starts with, what did the reader think when he read the text? And it's a simple idea. It's not new. But yeah, that's the
it seems like the salvation and the benefits, that's a benefit of worshiping Yahweh. Right. Is the forgiveness and
exactly, forgiveness is a subset. Back to Him. Yep.
Right. Beautiful. It's not the main thing. It shouldn't be the main thing. Right. Like He should be your object of worship. And then He's like He says, He's like, you put me first, I'll add all these things to you. Like, that's a benefit of worshiping Yahweh.
Yeah. I think it puts it in perspective for me too, that especially Protestants put a lot of focus on faith alone. Oh, we're saved by faith alone. But what does it mean to believe in God over something else if you don't if you don't believe in anything else? And how do I know if I'm, because, just, this is always a funny example for me, like growing up, going to youth group and stuff, idols meant if you spend more time playing video games than reading your Bible, that's an idol. Right,
yeah.
And now it's like, no, like I worship Yahweh and I do what he says to do.
And you still play video games, right? You're not doing idolatry. That's a great example that a lot of people miss, that if you use the word idol in a way that Moses meant it, you wouldn't use it that way. You would never call a car or a chariot an idol. It's just unfair to the story. So,
Yep.
So we're back to the question, how did this get started? I don't know. But it just, to me, the answers are pretty simple. But then when you say that, it sounds, and I've been accused of this, so is Mike, who do you think you are? And I'm saying, well, I don't think I'm anybody. I'm just saying, look at the text and tell me.
Right.
It just seems like it's right in front of us. But, and by the way, since your dad was a pastor and I was a pastor and my dad was a pastor, it's like watching sausage be made. There's a couple of things you don't want to see, right, in life. And one is that. The other is watching your pastor get licensed through his denomination. I've been through that, that licensure board thing a dozen or so times, including my own. All you got to do, and if anyone's listening and wants to get licensed, here's the magic key. Just memorize the denominational handbook. Memorize it. Know what to say when you're asked a certain question. And don't deviate. So I sat on these boards myself, and the question would be asked to the candidate, describe the Trinity, and he would basically quote the denominational handbook. And I had it right in front of me, page 156, there it is. And one time I did the wrong thing. I put my hand up and I said, could you explain the part about the part where you said this? Because I knew it was just straight out of the book, and the Bible itself wasn't saying something, but he was quoting it from the book. And before he even gave the answer, the chairman of the group looked over at me askance and said, I think he's answered the question. And it just struck me, we're not here to talk about the Bible. We're here to talk, can you quote the denominational handbook adequately? And so once you find out that that's what it takes to become licensed, and maybe that sounds a bit over the top, I'm telling you, I sat through these, guys. If you quote it properly, it's amazing how far you'll get. And now you're up in front of people on a Sunday morning, and they think since you're licensed, now you must know your Bible. No, all you're doing is keeping that ball of inertia going downhill. And that's, again, it sounds strong, but I think that's why we're, where we are. There are, and this was Mike's view, this Middle Earth idea, he called it. He found that, in his theory was that there's 3 to 4 people in every church in America that love their church, love their pastor. They're not going anywhere and they shouldn't, but they want more. And that's what Mike was shooting for. It's that person who wants more, but they're not going to go anywhere. Right. And he was there for that. So.
Yeah. See, I was a part of some denominational things where I would hear church fathers and creeds quoted more than the Bible and Jesus. Yeah. And that
scary stuff.
It was, man. When I didn't notice it at first, but when I looked back, I was like, man, I was like memorizing all these other things than my Bible. And it's no bueno.
Something that has come up on the podcast before. Actually, our one of our recent episodes, we had an interview with a Orthodox priest who used to be a Satanist. So it was a really interesting story.
Yeah, wow. Now you're talking about Greek Orthodox, or
I think so.
Yeah.
So he's Orthodox Christian, and but anyway, just from talking to him and from kind of looking into that too, because that's a totally strange world to me that grew up, like I said, in modern church services. Went to a non-denominational church my whole life, and just anyway, it seems like there are some groups, and I think the Orthodox Church is one of them, that are a little more open to kind of that spiritual view of the world and of the Bible. And why have we, like, kind of the mainstream Christianity?
Moderns,
Why have we lost that, and why does it scare people? I mean,
if you want, if if you want a denomination that is closest to, I would call, the biblical model of the cosmology of the first century, or even Moses, it would be Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy and such. They have a fantastic view, by the way, and maybe you can't. Well, here's the problem: it's unfair to do this with any denomination, and that is pick and choose what you want out of it, and say, I'm going to take this and this, like a restaurant menu, when really it all works as a system. For Orthodoxy, as well as for evangelicalism, it's a system, so it's really unfair to pick and choose. But what I love about the Orthodox view, particularly, is their view of resurrection and theosis, what they call theosis, or what Augustine called deification. And 2 Peter 1:4, we participate in theos. And theosness is the word. Somehow and there's that word that means God, or it's translated as God in every location in the New Testament, some 2,000 times. And here it's used of me after I resurrect. And so I take that to mean, and so does the Eastern Orthodox Church, that there is some kind of a story in the Bible of humans replacing the deities of the Old Testament in the long run, that you get this great replacement story going on because of Psalm 82 and other hints like that. Jeremiah 10:10, Isaiah 24, Zephaniah 2. There's various places where the gods of the Old Testament are promised to, quote, be destroyed. And the idea of their role being given, Daniel 7, the role of an Elohim or a ruler in the divine world being given that to the people of Israel. I think there's enough there, and the Orthodox Church is all over this. And so I like that view. Now, there's other parts of the Orthodoxy that I don't buy into, but
Sure.
Again, they don't let you just come in and grab what you want and walk away either. So
Right.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of that scripture where, I don't know it off the top of my head, but he says we become partakers of the divine nature.
That's the one. It's 2 Peter 1:4.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. And it's like, and Dr. Heiser talked about that as well. Like we are the sons of God in the New Testament.
Yeah, 1 John 3:2.
They're always talked
Beloved,
about
we are
as
the sons. Yeah,
right. It's so cool.
I think there's a shock value. I mean, that again, to the first century listener who knew his Old Testament well, like a Peter or a John, they're fishermen, but you get the sense they knew their Old Testament, and they were living the story, shall we say. And here comes Jesus, who is they believe to be the Messiah, the one that God sent. And when he and others who would quote the Old Testament and keep that story moving forward, they didn't just stop with going to heaven. They were angling toward this idea that a resurrected human and a resurrected creation, shall we say, is going to be in the next age. And so, is it Luke 20 verse 6 or 12? Luke 20, Jesus talks about us being like angels, equal to angels. Well, like there again. Now watch that. See, it's not an angel. Jesus is saying you're going to be equal to the gods of the Old Testament. So,
wow.
If you take out the word angel in English, put angelos back in there, and realize, this is chapter 5 of my dissertation, that in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Septuagint was, that was the era of the Greek translation. They often would put the word angelos in Greek on top of the word Elohim. When they were translating, like Psalm 8, they said we're created below the angeloi. They knew that the angeloi or Elohim are the created gods of the first commandment, but by that point in Greek language, you could say angelos, and use that for those deities as a sense of they're missions or missionaries for Yahweh, that kind of thing. But again, don't think angel; that's too medieval. And in other words, so by the time you get to Jesus, he's using the word angelos for the gods themselves.
Something that stands out to me with that is how I guess there's kind of two sides to it. One is I feel like most Christians would say, well, that sounds this idea of theosis or whatever sounds very new agey or Gnostic or, something like that. And on the other side, you realize when you realize what the Bible's talking about, that there are all these religions and all these spiritual beliefs that are focused on enlightenment and raising yourself up and becoming your own God or whatever. And it's like that's in Christianity. That's something, I guess, that's built into humans, that we look to be redeemed, but Christianity shows us the way to achieve that. And That's something that clicked for me when I realized that. I was like, oh, so they're looking for something in the wrong place,
And that was another question that I was thinking of, like what's the difference of a divine council in what we're talking about, as opposed to like what a Jehovah's Witness would say.
And I don't know my JW theology enough. I just don't know.
And I could be wrong with, like, it could be Mormonism, but I think it's Jehovah's Witness, that they teach a divine council and that they recognize that there's other gods. And
the guilt by association, I just don't think we have to worry about. And I know that Mike became, and I became fast friends with a Mormon during my dissertation phase, because when I told him my view, he was the head of a stake of Mormons up here in Minnesota. And we had coffee quite often. And I was a pastor of an E-Free church, and he was a Mormon leader, and yet we fellowshipped a lot.
That's why you got kicked out.
Yeah, right. When I would explain, well, we had a fun time, because what we would do every month, we'd get together, and I had an assignment from Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, whatever, to read. He had an assignment from me, and we'd always come prepared to ask each other why and what's going on.
Yeah,
I don't want to get into that, but the point of the gods thing, there were numerous places where he said, "Oh yeah, that's the gods of the Old Testament," as though they believed in them. Now, where they take that with Jesus and stuff is beyond what I think I could demonstrate. So that's why the guilt by association to me doesn't work. In other words, they may believe in other gods, but that has nothing to do with what I'm saying about the biblical story. That also includes them. So I was just looking up as you were talking about the weirdness of becoming a divine being. Revelation 3, is it 9, somewhere there? He who overcomes will sit on my throne. And I see Jesus sliding over and letting me sit on his throne. Now, if that ain't weird.
Yeah.
In other words, wild to think about, huh?
Yeah, I've often said, take all the weird verses out of the Bible, and you're down to about 3. So don't do that, right? It's a weird idea that God would make what he did and have angels, or have gods, but the atheist view of the world is weird too, that this is all here by happenstance. In other words, choose your weird and go with it. Don't claim that your view is not weird. At some point, everybody's view is outstandingly weird.
Right. So, what is weird, really?
Resurrection's weird,
Yeah.
We'll get up.
Wild. Yeah. We actually had an episode where we talked about bodies. We talked about 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul talking about the tent. It's 2 Corinthians 5, 1 Corinthians 15, I think. He talks about both places, that putting on a tent. We have an earthly tent and we have a heavenly tent, and Jesus was the.
This is a bit off topic, but what do you think about conditional immortality? This is where Mike was. This is where I was, and still am. The idea that and again, we're getting off topic, but to me, that's what podcasts are for. How about the idea that God created man mortal, carbon-based, made to reproduce, thus die? That's normal. That's not a curse. That's simply how man was made. And the way that Adam and Eve stayed alive was to eat the tree of life. And once they lost the access to the tree, they thus became, quote, normal, and died. And that what the promise is of the Bible is that if you believe in the right God and trust your life to the right deity, he will undo the man of dust story. In other words, the story or the problem coming out of Genesis 2 and 3 is not the sin of Adam, it's the made of dust issue. We're facing death every day. Hebrews 2, we fear death. So what if the great reward, shall we say, is the reversing of death, and thus the opposite of that, or quote hell, or whatever the end for a non-believer is simply to experience the way they were made to be, and that is to die. In other words, conditional immortality simply argues that the atheist will die like a dog. He will get what he wants. The Christian will get eternal life. He'll get what he wants. Everybody in the end, this sounds like C.S. Lewis,
get what they want,
gets what he wanted. And some get eternal life and some get snuffed out. And I'm not solving a lot of things, and I'm not arguing against hell here without knowing I'm going to stir up a bee's nest. But I think there's so many options like that when you get into the biblical story, to be fair to it, there's a lot of options that we have, and denominations will take a stand on certain things, and sometimes they'll admit that there's leeway. And I think that the Divine Council Worldview in itself gives a lot of leeway to these kind of things, because these are tough questions, and wherever there's a tough question, leeway needs to be granted. So,
well, we talked about that, Ryan. We talked about how we don't necessarily think Adam and Eve were perfect in the garden, and that they were immortal. Because God says in Genesis, He's like, no, put them out, because if they reach out and get the tree, they'll live forever. And so that's what sustained them.
I love that you asked us that, because that is exactly why we have this podcast. Josh and I literally started the podcast because we would sit and talk about these things, and our friends thought we were crazy. And we're like, we need to be recording this and see if anyone will listen. But we've talked about those exact things and brainstormed, like, oh, what is the man of dust? What are the garments of skin? What is the role of death? Could Adam and Eve be injured in the garden? Could he, stub his toe? Like,
tell him the garments of skin and see what he says. See if he.
I'd love to hear your view on that. Yeah,
it's
theory too.
It's a little wild.
Well, I think this is what you were saying, is that first of all, a lot of these topics are not necessarily salvation issues, and when people take hard stances on them, they tend to box people out, or one way or the other,
right?
And that's not what the gospel is about. And so that's one of the reasons why we have this podcast, because we like to kind of brainstorm and toss these ideas around. The garments of skin thing. Going off of, I guess I'm just going to repeat kind of what I said in that episode about bodies. But when we were reading Paul in 1st and 2nd Corinthians talking about the earthly body and the heavenly body, it seems to me that he is using terms to reverse what happened in the Garden of Eden. That he's saying that because Christ became man and died and now has a spirit, a heavenly body, that's what's going to happen to us. And the words that he used, I'd have to have it right in front of me to remember. But the words that he uses seem to kind of draw to mind that Adam and Eve were made in the image of God, and that when they disobeyed God, he changed their body, in some way. And whether that was they were some kind of spiritual being and they physically got a skin suit, or whether that was they were flesh and bone, but he removed his protection from them. I mean, we don't know exactly what it means, but now they have a body that's subject to sin and death. And that's what Jesus saves us from. So
it's interesting, and I'm glad you're catching that. It doesn't say animal skin in the text. It just says skin.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, we got a lot of pushback on that when we had our episode. We were like, there's no animal mentioned there. There was like,
no animals.
What?
Yeah, so the idea of sacrifice is usually brought in here, that God sacrificed an animal and gave him skin, but that's reading into it. Yeah, clearly.
Yeah.
My theory, and this is just as weird, is that they are made of dust. Right, chapter 2, he molds this man of dust. Then he takes part of his side, like the side of a beef. It doesn't mean rib, but it just means side, and takes that and makes a woman out of it. So if I've got that in my video version, I've got a guy of dust, no skin.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he gets a skin later. So
that's pretty much what we were talking about. We're like, I think, like, we were going back and forth. We're like, I think the skin there means like our skin that we have now. Like,
and to me, that's again, how would the first reader look at that? I think they would say, okay, that's when we got skin. And if the reader said, or someone said, that's weird. Again, it's all weird. Don't start weird in any one verse.
All right, see, there you go, everybody. Everybody that's listening, Dr. Johnson is
so
confirmed.
What really kind of sold me on that idea that the skin was not just animal skin, not just clothes, was again that how like in John 1 he says that the word tabernacled, he put on flesh, and how all throughout the Gospels it talks about Christ putting on flesh, taking on the form of a man, taking on the form of a servant, and that when we die, we take on the form like Christ, like the resurrected Christ.
Yeah.
And just in all of those instances where it's mentioned in the New Testament, it just seems to be kind of like how, again, another thing Dr. Michael Heiser would say is that a lot of people focus on what happened in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3 as the cause of all the problems in the world. But Jesus or God is also trying to solve, things that happened in Genesis 6 with the flood and things that happened in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. Yeah. And so when they talk about death and bodies and stuff, it seems to be solving the garment of skin in Genesis 3. So so anyway, that we did a whole, I think, episode and a half on that topic, just kind of brainstorming. And like you said, people were like, no, there's no way. That's not what it means. So.
We've been slowly going through Genesis. And so it's a blessing that you guys are going to be going through Genesis as well. Right. So we can kind of compare and correct our theology where we need to. But how tall were the Nephilim?
In the Noah movie, remember the Russell Crowe Noah movie?
Right, yeah, they were rock monsters.
Yeah, they were rock monsters. Yeah, they're big. Yeah. So I don't know. They're big
I think
enough.
he got that. Did he get that from the Enochian literature? Doesn't it say that they were thrown down into the rocks or something?
I turned to my wife during the movie. We were in the theater watching the Noah movie, and I turned to her. I didn't know what it was going to be about. I thought it would be about Noah, Mm-hmm. But I turned to her and I said, "This is the Book of Enoch." They're actually playing out the story that Enoch has. So it would have been helpful in the credits or the somewhere said, at the beginning of the movie, inspired by events in the Book of Enoch. But
Oh, I got one more thing I want to ask you. That me and Ryan have debated about and talked about. Noah was an albino. Have you heard that one?
No, I've not heard it.
We're getting way into
conspiracy world, but it's so much fun. So in the Book of Enoch, it talks about the birth of Noah.
Yeah,
and his father. Who was his father? Was it
Lamech?
Lamech, whatever. He freaks out, and he's like, "Oh, he looks like one of the angels, like one of the sons of God."
Oh, okay.
And he runs to Methuselah, and he's like, "Hey, like I'm scared because he looks like one of the sons of God. He's white. His skin is white. His hair is white." Okay. And Methuselah tells him like, "No, he's all right. He's not been corrupted or anything." Mm-hmm. So we had this idea that like maybe the sons of God are like bright white and it's like white hair, and I don't know. It was just an interesting. I was like, what if he was an albino?
Yeah.
Can't prove it, can't disprove it.
Right, yeah, exactly. Just tell me I'm right so we can move on.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
brilliant piece of
I have an on-topic question.
Brilliant exegetical, yeah. All right, real question.
Just kind of to wrap up here, because we're about to hit an hour here and we want to be respectful of your time. But
sure.
Something we like to do on the podcast, because we can talk about random things like this Noah and albino or theological things like the theosis and stuff. But I want to ask you, for our listeners, since we're talking about the Divine Council Worldview, and it's kind of a controversial topic, practically, how does this affect our belief? Like as Christians, when we're walking out our faith, the way that we treat people or sharing the gospel, evangelizing, things like that, has that changed the way that you exercise your faith? And so just kind of on a practical note, how would you?
Yeah. Completely, and I'm not being dishonest here or disingenuous, that to believe that the other gods are real and watch what happens because of that Abraham's righteousness comes because he converts from the worship of those deities to Yahweh. That's Joshua 24:2 compared to Genesis 12:3. That he makes that move of simple worship change. And so the question now, as I read the Bible, this is where that change you're asking, how does it change my daily life? When I read the Bible asking which God am I worshiping and thus becoming righteous because of that worship alone, that's it. Now I read the Psalms, for example, and I hear David relishing in his righteousness. He believed he was a thoroughly righteous man. How did he get that view? Where did he get that from? Again, he got it from the story that as long as I stick with Yahweh, I start my day with Yahweh, I end my day with Yahweh. I might still have a Bathsheba incident and the Uriah thing, but you know what? If I've got Yahweh, I'm still righteous. To me, that has taken the weight of the sin management model away. I don't I've heard this so much in my life. I just recoil at it now. Maybe I shouldn't, but the idea that God can't stand me, but he loves me, right? That's the message we give people. He loves you, but because you're a sinner, he can't stand you. So it's more like pity, right? That I really want to have you in heaven, but I can't, so I'm going to have to send Jesus to die for you. And it sounds almost romantic. I mean, I've had people cry, when they hear this.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, and again, you asked me, so I'm going to tell you, that to me, a God who, Exodus 34, this is well before, right, New Testament, Exodus 34 and all through the Psalms, God is righteous, gracious, merciful, and loving. He's already that, okay? So I'm not having to find that in the New Testament. I'm not inventing the idea of grace with Jesus. Oops. I'm realizing that Yahweh is a gracious deity by definition. And if I give my life to him, I will experience what David did in the Psalms, and that is a gracious, loving, forgiving, 100% forgiving. I don't have to wait for theological arguments to figure out how I'm forgiven. I just have a God who forgives. That to me that has changed me. And so if I do what the Bible does and I join the story of Scripture, which is which family do I enter and thus what God do I worship within that family, now it takes all that burden of sin management off. And so if I was pastoring today, I would never preach a behavioral sermon. I just wouldn't go down that path anymore because, again, what people usually come into on a Sunday morning is the expectation of the same museum, the same 4 rooms of the museum, frankly. It's going to be the same idea of sin management and doing it better, trying harder.
Yeah.
And God loves you, but he can't stand you. Remember that. Don't ever think you're a good person because as soon as you get down that path, that's pride. And, in other words, it's just, we have just built this system, and I'm talking about normal evangelicalism. We've built this system where the sermons are always going to presume the worst because God hates sin and we got to get a substitute for it, blah, blah, blah. And I'm saying throw that whole thing out. That's not the story of the Bible. And how do I get that? Because if you follow the Bible, they don't talk like that. I'm just saying look at the story and you won't hear that. You'll hear about people who are righteous because they simply love Yahweh. And that'll come into Jesus too, and that's another story. But the point is, you asked me how it changes things, and I could go on, but that to me is the theme, and it all comes because of other gods being real. That God's anger, his jealousy, is not because of my sinfulness, being a bad person, or he's not mad at me for being a sinner. He's mad at me because I give my loyalty to another actual living being. It's like if I was calling someone on the phone and I use real loving terms, can't wait to see you, love you, and my wife grabbed the phone and it was a dial tone, she'd be sad. She wouldn't be mad.
Right.
And the point is, when God grabs the phone from these people who are worshiping other gods, there's not a dial tone there. That's an actual being who's being worshipped, and he's answering prayers. He's giving joy and happiness even to these people that worship them. That's why when they enter Canaan, remember, God said, don't ask how to worship the other gods. That presupposes it must have been a very enjoyable worship pattern that they had, and it was tempting to become a Canaanite in that sense. And so, long story there, but I love the question. To me, it has absolute meaning that would change how I would ever, approach the podium as a pastor. But God does not want me doing that now. He wants me being a technical writer for a bank. So I'm glad to have that role. I mean,
praise the Lord for.
Well, you have plenty of other ways to reach people. It seems you're very busy. So.
Well, what all do you have your hands in? So you're
I thank you.
The podcast.
I would love to tell you guys because I want help. When Mike died, we sat at her table, Adrina's table, my wife and I, and we first talked about her, how she's doing, and then she said there are things that Mike had going that need to be done. And he had a long list. He had made a list of things. When I die, here's the things I want to get done.
Wow.
One of them was a systematic theology book. Now, we had talked about this well before he got sick. But that is, the Unseen Realm is a great book, but it's not a theology textbook, right? It's not a systematic theology. So Mike's goal was to have a systematic theology textbook that could take all this stuff and put it into, discernible chapters that were divided by topic. And so Drina turned to me there and said, would you do that? She didn't know if I would say yes because, just being busy, but I was hoping she would say that, because I've always wanted to do that. And so she gave me his work. It's like 9 chapters of work, but it's going to have to be a 40-page or 40-chapter book. It's just going to be a doozy, but I can't wait to do it. And I'm doing it now, but I need help. And so my plea in a place like this, where I'm talking to you guys and others, if people would be willing to, or want to, this is just throw it out there, to be like editors with me and be willing to have me send them stuff. Here's chapter 18. What do you think? I need, because this is so new to some degree. There's no theology book written with the Divine Council Worldview. So this is and plus, I'm doing it with Mike and me. So my conversation partner in the book isn't alive. So I have to repeat his words and be faithful to them, and then also give my view. And this is where it's going to be different. It's going to be a conversation between two people who usually agree, but not always. And so that's the goal. And but I'm trying to round up people who'd be willing to be an email list, where I can say, here's chapter 18, what do you think? And give back, constructive criticism. So
yeah, I don't think you'll have any trouble finding people.
You got 2 guys right here. I don't know if you want our opinions on it.
Yeah,
but.
and so I'd be willing to give out my email address if that's okay, and say, anyone who wants, now, and again, you don't owe me anything, but you'd become part of a list, and you'd be willing to at least get the stuff and help me think through it, because it's
that's really exciting.
It's aggressive.
That's really exciting.
It has to be done by next March, so it's a pretty aggressive timeline.
Oh, God bless you.
Yeah. I was going to say there's place for help for people that are not scholars or professionals in that sense.
Yep.
I mean,
oh, absolutely. It's going to be written to people who don't have that background. So that's why I want to bounce it off them and say, is this making sense?
Cool. Yeah. That's very cool.
Can I give you my email?
Yeah.
For people to use. It's just my name, Ronn Johnson, 2 N's, the number 7 @gmail.com. And again, just say, I'd love to help you edit the theology book or something like that. That would be enough for me to say thanks, and I'll just put you on a list. So
cool. Awesome.
Expect to get stuff every week for the next 52 weeks.
Dude, I'm ready to sign up now.
Well, and what would people be sending you back, and what kind of timeline?
Oh, just constructive criticism.
Okay.
Just anything they can come up with.
This makes sense, or this doesn't because.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
You have to tell me why it doesn't make sense.
Cool.
Now, what is the trajectory of the podcast, and what are you guys hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, we want to.
Now it's you and Mike Chu. So
Mike Chu is a great guy. I'm so glad.
I just talked to him through email. We're going to try and get him on the show as well.
Oh, good. Yeah, when I was offered to do the podcast, again, this was a conversation between me and Drina. I said, could I have Mike Chu be my partner? And she said, I think he's awfully busy. And I said, I know, but can I at least ask him? And when he said yes, boy, my day became very, very happy. And he knows Mike well. He knows his stuff. He's just a good guy, and he can think on his feet so well. So what we do is we just do this. The beauty of a podcast is you realize we might as well do this in front of an audience because we're having fun. And so we decided to do Genesis because Mike never got there providentially, and it's a good place to start. And we're just looking at the text through Divine Council eyes. And so we're going to skip stuff that we don't think is important to that, but we're going to really hone in on things that like Genesis 6 and whatever. And then we'll probably jump over the New Testament. This is what I've done in other Bible studies I've run, is you just keep hopping back and forth between Old and New Testament. So we'll probably head into the New Testament to a book. And it'll always be textual. We might do some studies, topics, but basically Bible nerds would enjoy it, I think.
Yeah, you guys definitely need to do like a question and answer session so we can shoot some stuff to you.
Okay, I'll and I'm not a techie, so I don't know how to do that. I'll just tell Mike, hey, figure this out.
We'll write you a letter.
But we do hope, and thank you for the question. My goal is very aggressive, is to democratize the view so that in 100 years from now, every major denomination has a Divine Council Worldview as its way of reading the Bible. And if a person says that's too aggressive, well, if we fail and get 20% of that, we're still winning. So
exactly,
that's great.
Exactly,
helping people realize this is a normal thing. It's not weird. It just means read your Bible the way it was meant to be read, and you're going to be surprised what you see. That's all we're trying to say.
Well, it's apparently only weird if you're an American evangelical. I mean, or some kind of Western, Westernized Christian. And that's another thing that when I learned it helped other religions and other cultures fit into my worldview, and even Christians in other cultures, what they're kind of competing with.
Right.
So
dude, it's like a biblical matrix. We've got to help people wake up to the Divine Council Worldview.
Yes.
But here's the real world.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe the podcast model, which again, 10 years ago, we didn't even have this, so maybe this will be the next way that God providentially has for this goal to be reached. And that is to get into the homes and lives of very normal people in very normal ways that they couldn't do because they're living in a place that they just can't get access to books and all that stuff. So.
Well, I think people are starting to latch onto it. I mean, Dr. Heiser was getting pretty popular there. He was selling a lot of the Unseen Realm books. There's some other podcasts that we've listened to that are getting very popular that talk about these kinds of topics. And so it's encouraging.
It is.
So welcome to the club.
Okay, good. Glad to be a part of it.
Well,
and so that's the Divine Council Worldview Podcast.
Right. And we're up to episode 4, I think, at this point. As we've recorded like 9 of them, but they're coming out now once a week. Yeah. So
and it's
a weekly, every Sunday night drop.
Every Sunday night, and it's on Apple Podcasts.
Yeah, Spotify. Again, the list of platforms, I think, is up to about 8 or something like that. Again,
so pretty much anywhere people would normally listen.
You'll find it.
Great.
Well, man, Dr. Johnson, we appreciate you so much. We are definitely going to have you back on to talk about more fun things like
I'd love to do
human skin and, and albinos.
Let's go down that path a little deeper.
Yeah, any crazy thoughts that you have, save them for us.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, we appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep. God bless.